I shot my wife in the heart with a bullet made of her own lies, and watching her bleed out financially and socially was the most satisfying thing I've ever done in my life. Now before you call the police, let me be clear, I didn't lay a finger on Sarah Johnson. I didn't have to. Sometimes the most devastating weapon you can use against someone is their own betrayal, and by the time I was done with my wife, she wished I had just put an actual bullet in her instead of destroying her with the truth. My name is Marcus Johnson, and I'm about to tell you how I went from being the most pathetic excuse for a husband in Atlanta to orchestrating the most brilliant revenge scheme you've ever heard. This is the story of how I discovered that the woman sleeping next to me every night was the architect of my own financial prison, and how I made her pay for every single lie she told, every dollar she stole, and every moment she made me feel worthless. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, back when I still believed my wife loved me, back when I thought I was just another hardworking man trying to provide for his family, back when I had no idea that every morning when I picked up those keys from the kitchen counter, I was literally paying my own wife to destroy my self-esteem. For 3 years, I had calloused hands from gripping steering wheels 12 hours a day, bloodshot eyes from navigating Atlanta traffic, and a heart heavy with the weight of being what I thought was the sole provider for my family. Every morning at 5 a.m., I'd kiss Sarah and our 2 children goodbye, grab my keys, and head out to face another day of hustling in the rideshare and delivery business. I drove for Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, you name it, anything to keep that Ford Transit van on the road because that van was my lifeline. What I didn't know was that those keys I picked up every morning were actually the keys to my own financial coffin, and the undertaker was cooking my breakfast and telling me she loved me every single day. You see, I thought I was renting my van from a company called Crown Transport Services. Every week, without fail, I'd drive to their office in downtown Atlanta, hand over $1,800 to a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Thompson, get my receipt, and drive away believing I was one step closer to eventually owning my own vehicle. Mrs. Thompson would always remind me that late payments meant immediate seizure of the vehicle, no exceptions, no second chances, no mercy. I respected that kind of business discipline. I thought it showed professionalism. For 3 years, I was the model client. Rain or shine, sick or healthy, I'd show up with that money. There were weeks when I'd skip meals, weeks when I'd work 18-hour days, weeks when I'd borrow money from friends just to make sure I could keep that van on the road. Because without that van, there was no income, and without income, my family would suffer. And I would rather die than let my family suffer. But life has a way of testing even the most dedicated men, and 2023 was the year that tested me to my breaking point. First, I caught COVID and spent 4 days in bed, too weak to even sit up, let alone drive. Then my youngest daughter, Kemi, needed emergency surgery for appendicitis, which drained our savings faster than water down a broken pipe. Medical bills, missed work days, prescription costs, everything hit us at once like a financial tornado. By the time the weekend came around, I was $500 short of my weekly payment. $500. After 3 years of perfect payments, after pouring over $280,000 into this company, after sacrificing my health and sanity to meet their demands, I was $500 short and they acted like I was trying to steal from them. I sat in that Crown Transport Services office, my pride crumbling as I explained my situation to Mrs. Thompson. I told her about the COVID, about Kemi's surgery, about how I'd never missed a payment in 3 years. I begged her for just 1 week of grace, promised I'd make up the difference plus extra the following week. The woman listened with the compassion of a stone wall, then simply pointed to a clause in my contract that I'd signed 3 years earlier. Late payment equals immediate vehicle seizure. No negotiations. No payment plans. No mercy. I watched helplessly as they took my keys. I watched as my livelihood was driven away by someone else. I watched as 3 years of perfect payments meant absolutely nothing in the face of one missed deadline. I walked home that evening a broken man, dreading the conversation I'd have to have with Sarah about why there would be no money coming in until I could find another vehicle to rent. But when I walked through my front door that evening, instead of finding a supportive wife ready to weather the storm together, I found Sarah in the living room, pacing like a caged animal, her face twisted with a fury I'd never seen before. Before I could even explain what happened, she launched into me with a viciousness that took my breath away. "Marcus, you're pathetic," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls of our small apartment. "What kind of man can't even keep a simple car rental up to date? What kind of husband leaves his wife to wonder whether there'll be food on the table tomorrow? I'm tired of making excuses for you to my friends, tired of pretending that my husband is actually a provider when you can't even handle the most basic responsibility." I tried to explain about the COVID, about Kemi's surgery, about how hard I'd been working, but Sarah wasn't interested in explanations. She was interested in destroying what was left of my soul. My mother warned me about marrying a man with no vision, she continued, her words cutting deeper than any knife ever could. She said men like you never amount to anything, that you drag me down with your mediocrity. I should have listened to her. I should have married David Williams when I had the chance. At least he owns his own delivery fleet now, instead of begging for rentals like some common beggar. I felt something die inside me that night, something that had kept me going through all the difficult times, all the long days, all the sacrifices. It wasn't just the loss of the vehicle or even the financial stress that broke me. It was realizing that the woman I'd been working so hard to provide for, the woman I loved more than my own life, saw me as nothing more than a disappointment, a failure, a man not worthy of respect. I slept on the couch that night and the next night and the night after that. Sarah barely spoke to me except to remind me that real men find ways to solve their problems instead of wallowing in self-pity. She'd cook dinner for herself and the children, leaving me to figure out my own meals. She'd talk about our financial situation to anyone who would listen, always making sure to emphasize that it was her husband's incompetence that had put us in this position. Days turned into weeks and I found myself taking whatever work I could get. I'd stand at airport pickup zones hoping to get hired for cash rides. I'd deliver food in packages for a few dollars here and there. I'd do anything to bring some money home and prove to Sarah that I wasn't the failure she believed me to be. But nothing I did seemed good enough. Nothing seemed to restore her faith in me, and slowly I began to believe that maybe she was right. Maybe I really was just a pathetic excuse for a man. It was during one of these dark weeks that I got a call that would change everything. My friend Jamal, who worked as a security guard at an office complex in Buckhead, had some information that might help me get back on my feet. There was a transport company looking for drivers, good pay, flexible arrangements, and they were hiring immediately. The company was called Crown Transport Services. I felt a mix of hope and anxiety as I made my way to that office the next morning. This was my chance to get back behind the wheel, my chance to start earning real money again, my chance to prove to Sarah that I wasn't finished yet. But as I sat in that waiting area, surrounded by other hopeful drivers, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was familiar about this place. When Mrs. Thompson called my name, I stood up with renewed determination. This time I was going to negotiate better terms. This time I was going to make sure I understood every clause in the contract. This time I was going to protect myself from the kind of situation that had destroyed my life just weeks earlier. But as Mrs. Thompson led me toward her office, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Hanging on the wall behind the reception desk was a family photo, a photo I recognized because I'd taken it myself just 6 months earlier during Kemi's birthday party. In the photo, Sarah was smiling and holding our daughter, and next to her stood a woman I'd never seen before, except that woman was Mrs. Thompson. My mind started racing as pieces of a puzzle I didn't know existed began falling into place. I followed Mrs. Thompson into her office with legs that felt like they were made of lead, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. As she shuffled through papers on her desk, I noticed something else that made my stomach turn. There, in a silver frame right next to her computer, was another photo of Sarah, this one showing her at what looked like a business meeting, shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit, both of them smiling like people who just closed a very profitable deal. "Mr. Johnson," Mrs. Thompson said, looking up from her paperwork, "I understand you're looking for a vehicle to rent. We might be able to work something out, but I have to tell you, we've had problems with unreliable drivers in the past. There was one man, drove for us for 3 years, seemed dependable, but then he couldn't make his payments and we had to seize his vehicle. These kind of people, they make promises they can't keep, you understand?" I nodded slowly, my mind working furiously to process what I was discovering. Mrs. Thompson continued talking about terms and conditions, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I was thinking about 3 years of payments, 3 years of handing over $1,800 every week to this woman, 3 years of Sarah knowing exactly where I went every weekend to make those payments because I'd tell her every detail of my week when I got home. 3 years of Sarah comforting me when I was stressed about making payments, 3 years of her encouraging me to work harder when money was tight, 3 years of her acting like the supportive wife while she was actually the one profiting from my desperation. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from falling over. If you're enjoying this story of betrayal and revenge, make sure to subscribe to our channel because trust me, what I did next will shock you in the best possible way. "Mrs. Thompson," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my mind, "that driver you mentioned, the one who couldn't make his payments, what was his name?" Mrs. Thompson smiled, not realizing she was about to walk into a trap. "Oh, that was Marcus Johnson. Poor man, worked so hard but just couldn't manage his finances properly. His wife Sarah felt so bad for him. She's actually one of our business partners, you know. She's the one who suggested we give him a chance in the first place, said he was a hard worker but needed some structure in his life. The room started spinning around me as the full scope of my wife's betrayal became clear. Sarah hadn't just known about the rental arrangement, she had orchestrated it. She was earning money from my weekly payments while simultaneously criticizing me for not being a better provider. She had turned my own desperation to provide for my family into her personal profit center, and then had the audacity to punish me when I couldn't maintain the impossible standard she had set for me. I somehow managed to finish the meeting without revealing what I'd discovered. I told Mrs. Thompson I needed some time to think about the terms, shook her hand, and walked out of that office a completely different man than the one who had walked in. The broken, defeated Marcus was gone, replaced by someone with a clarity of purpose that was almost frightening in its intensity. For the next 2 weeks, I said nothing to Sarah about my discovery. Instead, I played the role of the desperate husband trying to get back on his feet, taking whatever odd jobs I could find, apologizing for my failures, accepting her criticism and contempt with what she probably thought was resigned acceptance. But I wasn't resigned, I was planning. Every evening, after Sarah would finish berating me for my lack of progress, I'd lie on that couch and work out the details of my revenge. It had to be perfect, it had to be devastating, and it had to expose Sarah's cruelty not just to me but to everyone who knew us. Because I had realized something important during those 2 weeks of planning. A woman capable of this level of betrayal didn't deserve just to be confronted, she deserved to be completely and utterly destroyed. I started by doing research, real research into Crown Transport Services and my wife's involvement in the company. What I found was even worse than I'd initially thought. Sarah wasn't just a silent partner skimming money off my rental payments, she was actually one of the primary owners of the company, which meant she had been directly profiting from my misery for 3 years while playing the role of the suffering wife at home. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized that Sarah's betrayal extended far beyond just the car rental scheme. Crown Transport Services had multiple drivers, men who probably had no idea that their rental payments were going directly into the pockets of their contractors' family members. Sarah had built an entire business model around exploiting desperate men who were trying to provide for their families, and I was just one of many victims. However, I also discovered something else during my research, something that would become the foundation of my revenge plan. Crown Transport Services had been cutting corners on their tax obligations, underreporting their income, and engaging in several practices that would be very interesting to the Internal Revenue Service. Sarah had been so focused on maximizing her profits that she'd been sloppy about covering her tracks, and I now had documentation of every shady transaction, every unreported payment, every violation of business regulations that the company had committed over the past 3 years. I spent my days gathering evidence and my evenings enduring Sarah's continued verbal abuse, but now her words bounced off me like stones off armor. Every insult she threw at me, every comparison to more successful men, every reminder of what a disappointment I was just added fuel to the fire of my determination. Sarah had no idea that she was insulting a man who held the power to destroy everything she'd built. The first phase of my revenge began 3 weeks after my discovery. I started by creating anonymous social media accounts and carefully, methodically, began documenting Sarah's double life. I posted photos of her at Crown Transport Services events, photos of her in expensive clothes that no woman married to a struggling driver should be able to afford, photos of her laughing and celebrating with business partners while her husband supposedly couldn't even afford to keep a rental car. But I was careful to never directly accuse Sarah of anything in these posts. Instead, I simply presented the evidence and let people draw their own conclusions. I shared the posts in community groups where our neighbors were members, I tagged mutual friends, I made sure that everyone in Sarah's social circle would start asking questions about how the wife of a supposedly struggling driver could afford such an obviously expensive lifestyle. The second phase involved my family and friends, the people who had watched me struggle for years, the people who had lent me money when I was short on rental payments, the people who had felt sorry for Sarah having to deal with such an unreliable husband. I began sharing my story with them, not all at once, but gradually, letting them understand the full scope of how I'd been manipulated and betrayed. My brother Tund was the first to fully understand what had happened, and his reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. Tund was furious, not just at Sarah's deception, but at how she'd turned me into a laughingstock among people who cared about me. Tund started his own investigation, reaching out to other drivers who rented vehicles from Crown Transport Services, and what he found was a pattern of exploitation that went far beyond my situation. Several drivers reported similar experiences, men who worked themselves to exhaustion to make payments to a company that showed no mercy for late payments, Men whose families suffered while Crown Transport Services profited from their desperation. But none of these men knew that their rental payments were actually going to enrich the families of people in their own communities, people who then had the audacity to look down on them for their financial struggles. Phase 3 of my plan was the most satisfying because it involved turning Sarah's own cruelty against her. I started documenting every instance of abuse, every insult, every time Sarah made me feel worthless for failing to meet obligations that she herself had designed to be nearly impossible to maintain. I recorded conversations, I saved text messages, I created a comprehensive record of how a woman had psychologically tortured her husband while secretly profiting from his misery. But I didn't plan to use this documentation for a divorce proceeding or even for personal vindication. I had something much more devastating in mind, something that would expose Sarah's character not just to me, but to everyone who knew her, including our children when they were old enough to understand what kind of person their mother really was. The fourth phase was where I demonstrated just how much I'd learned about business and revenge during my weeks of planning. Instead of simply exposing Sarah's deception, I decided to become a competitor. I used my knowledge of Crown Transport Services operations, my understanding of their weaknesses, and my connections with exploited drivers to create my own transport company. I called my new venture Fair Deal Transport, and my business model was everything that Crown Transport Services wasn't. Transparent pricing, fair payment terms, support for drivers going through temporary difficulties, and most importantly, complete honesty about ownership and profit sharing. I reached out to every driver who had been mistreated by Crown Transport Services and offered them better terms, better treatment, and the respect they deserved as hardworking men trying to provide for their families. The response was overwhelming. Word spread quickly through the driver community about this new company that actually treated people fairly, and within a month, I had convinced more than half of Crown Transport Services drivers to switch to Fair Deal Transport. Sarah's company went from being highly profitable to struggling almost overnight, but she still had no idea that her own husband was the architect of her business's downfall. At home, Sarah became even more vicious as her income started declining, blaming me for bringing bad luck into our household, accusing me of being cursed, suggesting that my very presence was somehow contaminating our family's prosperity. She had no idea that the man she was insulting controlled the future of her business empire, and I let her continue her abuse because every word she spoke was more evidence of her true character. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because my final move is going to leave you speechless. Phase 5 was my masterstroke, the move that would transform me from victim to victor in the most spectacular way possible. I had been building relationships with journalists, bloggers, and social media influencers who specialized in exposing corporate fraud and personal betrayal stories. I'd been feeding them information gradually, helping them understand the scope of what Crown Transport Services had been doing, but I'd been waiting for the perfect moment to release the full story. That moment came when Sarah, frustrated by her declining business income and increasingly desperate to maintain her lifestyle, made a critical mistake. She approached me with a proposition that was so audacious, so completely tone-deaf, that I almost couldn't believe she was serious. "Marcus," she said one evening, her voice dripping with fake concern, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I might know someone who can help you get back on your feet. There's this transport company, Crown Transport Services, and I've heard they're looking for reliable drivers. The owner is a friend of a friend, and I might be able to put in a good word for you." I looked at my wife, this woman who had spent months telling me I was worthless, this woman who had profited from my misery while pretending to suffer alongside me, this woman who was now offering to help me get a job with the very company she owned, and I felt a calm satisfaction that was almost spiritual in its intensity. "That's very kind of you, Sarah," I replied, my voice steady and calm. "I'll definitely look into that opportunity. In fact, why don't we go there together tomorrow? You can introduce me to your friend personally." Sarah's face went through several interesting expressions as she processed the suggestion, but she'd committed to the lie and had no choice but to follow through. "Of course," she said, though I could see the panic in her eyes. "I'll call my friend tonight and set up a meeting." That evening, I made my own phone call, but not to arrange a meeting. I called the team of journalists I'd been working with and told them that tomorrow would be the day for the story they'd been preparing to break for weeks. Everything was in place, all the evidence was documented, all the victims were ready to go on record, and tomorrow Sarah's world would come crashing down in the most public way possible. The next morning, I dressed in my best clothes for what I knew would be the most important performance of my life. Sarah and I arrived at the Crown Transport Services office together, with Sarah looking increasingly uncomfortable as she realized she was about to be caught in the most elaborate lie of her life. Mrs. Thompson's face when she saw Sarah and me walk in together was worth every moment of suffering I had endured over the past months. The woman clearly had no idea how to handle this situation, but before she could say anything, I took control of the conversation. "Mrs. Thompson," I said, my voice loud enough for everyone in the office to hear, "I'd like you to meet my wife, Sarah Johnson." "Sarah, this is Mrs. Thompson, the woman I've been making rental payments to for the past 3 years, the woman who seized my vehicle when I was $500 short on my payment, the woman who called me unreliable and financially irresponsible." The silence in that office was deafening as everyone processed what I had just said. Sarah's face went completely white as she realized that her husband somehow knew everything, but I wasn't finished. "Sarah," I continued, turning to face my wife directly, "Mrs. Thompson was just telling me about what a supportive wife you are, how you're actually one of the business partners here at Crown Transport Services, how you suggested they give me a chance because I was such a hard worker who just needed some structure in my life." I could see Sarah's mind racing, trying to find some explanation, some way to talk her way out of this situation, but I had spent weeks preparing for this moment and I wasn't about to let her escape. "You know what's interesting, Sarah?" I said, pulling out my phone and opening the voice recording app that had been running since we walked into the building. "For 3 years, you let me believe that I was renting this vehicle from strangers, that my financial struggles were my own fault, that my inability to make payments on time made me a failure as a husband and father." My voice grew stronger as I continued. "For 3 years you took money out of our household budget so I could make rental payments to a company that you owned, then you came home and criticized me for not being able to provide better for our family. You turned my own desperation to be a good provider into your personal profit center, then had the nerve to punish me when I couldn't maintain payments to a company that was essentially robbing me." By now, everyone in the Crown Transport Services office was listening, and I could see Mrs. Thompson reaching for her phone, probably to call security, but I had planned for this too. "Don't bother calling security, Mrs. Thompson," I said calmly. "In about 5 minutes, this office is going to be visited by representatives from the Internal Revenue Service, the Georgia Secretary of State's office, and several journalists who are very interested in how Crown Transport Services has been operating. You see, when you exploit people for years, sometimes one of those people decides to fight back." Right on schedule, I could see official vehicles pulling up outside the building. Sarah was now visibly panicking, probably realizing that this wasn't just about our marriage anymore, that I had somehow managed to turn our personal conflict into a much larger legal and public relations disaster. "Marcus, please," Sarah whispered, grabbing my arm. "We can work this out, we can figure this out together. I know this looks bad, but I was trying to help you, I was trying to give you structure, I was trying to make you more responsible." I looked down at my wife's hand on my arm, this woman who had spent months making me feel worthless, this woman who had profited from my misery while pretending to be my victim, and I felt nothing but pity for her. "Sarah," I said, gently removing her hand from my arm, "you had 3 years to tell me the truth, 3 years to treat me with respect, 3 years to be the partner I thought I had married. Instead, you chose to lie to me, steal from me, and psychologically abuse me while I worked myself to exhaustion trying to provide for our family." The first journalist entered the building just as I was speaking, followed immediately by what appeared to be government officials with badges and briefcases. Sarah looked around desperately, probably looking for some escape route, but I had made sure there wasn't one. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, addressing the room full of officials, journalists, and increasingly nervous Crown Transport Services employees, "my name is Marcus Johnson, and I have a story to tell you about corporate fraud, tax evasion, and how some people build their wealth by exploiting the desperation of hardworking family men." What happened next was exactly what I had planned for weeks, but even better than I'd imagined. The journalists started asking questions, the government officials started examining documents, Mrs. Thompson started making phone calls to lawyers, and Sarah simply stood in the middle of it all, watching her carefully constructed world fall apart in real time. The tax investigation revealed that Crown Transport Services had been underreporting their income by hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past several years. The state investigation revealed that the company had been operating with improper licensing and had been engaging in deceptive business practices. The journalists' investigation revealed a pattern of exploitation that affected dozens of families throughout Atlanta. But the most devastating revelation was the personal story of how Sarah Johnson had systematically abused and defrauded her own husband while playing the role of the suffering wife to their friends and family. The recordings I had made of Sarah's verbal abuse, combined with the financial documents showing her ownership in Crown Transport Services, painted a picture of psychological manipulation that was so cruel it was almost unbelievable. Within 24 hours, the story had spread across social media, news websites, and was being discussed on radio programs throughout Georgia. Sarah went from being an anonymous housewife to being the face of spousal betrayal and corporate greed, and I went from being seen as a failure to being celebrated as a man who had fought back against systematic oppression. The business consequences for Crown Transport Services were immediate and devastating. Drivers abandoned the company in droves, switching to Fair Deal Transport and other competitors who offered honest, transparent relationships. Government fines and back taxes destroyed the company's financial stability. Negative publicity made it impossible to attract new clients. But the personal consequences for Sarah were even more severe. Friends who had pitted her for being married to such an unreliable man now understood that she had been the architect of our family's financial struggles. Family members who had criticized me for not being a better provider now knew that Sarah had been profiting from my desperation while playing the victim. The psychological impact on Sarah was exactly what I had hoped for. She went from being a woman who felt superior to her husband, a woman who believed she was smarter and more capable, to being someone whose intelligence and capability had been completely overshadowed by her cruelty and greed. She had been outwitted, outmaneuvered, and outclassed by the man she had spent years treating as inferior. I moved out of our apartment the day after the Crown Transport Services story broke, taking my children with me after presenting evidence to family court that Sarah had created an abusive household environment. The recordings of her verbal abuse, combined with evidence of her financial deception, made it clear that Sarah was not fit to have primary custody of our children. Fair Deal Transport thrived, growing from my revenge project into a legitimate business that employed dozens of drivers and operated with the kind of transparency and fairness that Crown Transport Services had never offered. I became a respected figure in the transport industry, known not just as a successful businessman, but as someone who had fought back against exploitation and won. Sarah, meanwhile, faced criminal charges for tax evasion and corporate fraud, civil lawsuits from drivers she had exploited, and social exile from the community that had once respected her as a struggling wife supporting an unreliable husband. Her attempts to rebuild her reputation were futile because I had documented every aspect of her betrayal so thoroughly that there was no way to deny or minimize what she had done. The final chapter of my revenge came 6 months after that confrontation in the Crown Transport Services office. Sarah, facing bankruptcy, criminal charges, and complete social isolation, approached me through her lawyer with a settlement offer. She wanted to give me everything, the house, the remaining assets from Crown Transport Services, even her personal savings in exchange for my agreement to stop cooperating with the various investigations into her business practices. My response was swift and final. I instructed my lawyer to tell Sarah's lawyer that I wasn't interested in her money, her property, or any form of financial compensation. What I wanted was something Sarah could never give me, which was 3 years of my life back, 3 years of respect and partnership that she had stolen from me through her lies and manipulation. Tell Mrs. Johnson, I said to my lawyer, that she can keep whatever assets she has left, but she'll be keeping them in prison because I'm going to cooperate with every investigation, testify in every proceeding, and make sure that everyone understands exactly what kind of person she is. True to my word, I testified against Sarah in her criminal trial, presenting evidence that helped convict her of fraud, tax evasion, and several other charges related to her business practices. Sarah received a prison sentence of 4 years with the possibility of parole in 2.5 years, but I made it clear that I would oppose any early release applications. The story of my revenge became legendary in Atlanta business circles, not just because of the complexity of my plan or the completeness of my victory, but because it demonstrated what could happen when someone pushed a good man too far. I had been willing to endure poverty, criticism, and abuse as long as I believed I was working toward a better future for my family, but once I discovered that my suffering was being deliberately orchestrated by the person I loved most, I became unstoppable. My children, now living with me in a comfortable apartment paid for by the profits from Fair Deal Transport, understood that their father had been the victim of a terrible betrayal, but they also learned valuable lessons about integrity, perseverance, and the importance of treating people with respect. I made sure they understood that their mother wasn't evil, just deeply flawed, and that they should forgive her while also learning from her mistakes. As for me, I emerged from this experience as a completely different man than the one who had started it. The broken, desperate driver who had once begged for mercy at Crown Transport Services was gone, replaced by a confident businessman who understood that true strength comes not from accepting abuse, but from refusing to tolerate it. I never remarried, choosing instead to focus on building my business, raising my children, and helping other men who found themselves in situations similar to what I had experienced. Fair Deal Transport became known not just as a successful company, but as a place where men could rebuild their lives after being exploited or betrayed by people they had trusted. My story proves that revenge, when executed with intelligence, patience, and precision, can be the most satisfying dish a man ever tastes. Sarah had spent 3 years believing that she was smarter than her husband, that she could manipulate me indefinitely while profiting from my desperation, but she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated the power of a good man who finally decides to fight back. And that's why they say that the most dangerous person in the world is someone who has nothing left to lose, because when a man discovers that his suffering has been orchestrated by the person he loves most, he becomes capable of achieving the impossible. I didn't just get revenge on my wife. I transformed myself into someone worthy of the respect that she had denied me for years, and in doing so, I proved that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person you were always capable of being. Make sure you've subscribed to our channel if you enjoyed this story, because we have many more tales of justice, revenge, and people getting exactly what they deserve. Sometimes life gives us exactly the lessons we need, delivered by exactly the people we least expect. And my story is proof that even the most devastating betrayals can become the foundation for the most spectacular comebacks.